Okay, so in this review lesson for category 1, we are going to be talking about factoring. So what does it mean to factor? It means write as a product of other polynomials, where you have to put your two parentheses, where you have to tell me what is going to make the rows and columns that I would multiply for my box. But the first thing you need to remember when you are factoring, or you are finding one of the factors, is you have to GCF first. So we're going to get our calculator and we're going to start factoring x squared minus 13x plus 22. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to find our A coefficient, and that is a 1. Our B coefficient is negative 13. So I'm going to go ahead and GCF those first. So I'm going to go math over 9, 1 comma, remember you can't GCF a positive number, so it's going to give me a 1. And now I'm going to GCF again with my C coefficient, which is 22. So math over 9. I'm going to take my answer for my first two GCF. When I GCF the first two numbers, I'm going to take that answer, comma, 22. And if your GCF is a 1, then you know that your A, B, and C coefficients are not going to change. So what we're going to do now is we are going to go to our X game, our X puzzle, and we're going to play that. So we're going to multiply A and C, which is 22, and then negative 13 is B. So I want to find two numbers that multiply to 22, but when I add them I get a negative 13. And so 11 and 2 is coming to mind, because 11 times 2 is 22. 11 and 2. But when I add, I'm going to go ahead and multiply. I get a 22 when I multiply them, but when I add 11 and 2, I don't get a positive 13, I get a negative 13, which tells me that they both need to be negative. So negative 11 times negative 2, that gives me a positive 22. Negative 11 plus a negative 2 is going to give me a negative 13. So you always want to check your side answers in your X puzzle that they multiply and add to the correct numbers. So now the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to write my first term, which is x squared here, and I'm going to write my constant in the bottom right box, positive 22. And now I know how I'm going to split up that negative 13x. It is actually going to be split up into negative 11x and negative 2x. And now that I know all my boxes, now I'm going to work backwards using my multiplication skills, and I'm going to figure this out. So I've got x and x gives me x squared. This would have to be a negative 11 to make a product of negative 11x. This would have to be a negative 2, so when I multiply I get negative 2x, and I'm going to double check my math that is positive 22. So now my factors are x minus 11 and x minus 2. Those are my factors. So next, I'm going to, before I start, I want to remember to GCF. So I'm going to get my calculator. I'm going to do math, right arrow 9, 3, comma 7, and I get a 1. So now I'm going to do math over 9 again. I'm going to take my first GCF answer, and then I'm going to do 2, and that is a 1. So again, my GCF happens to be 1, and I want to check that because I want to make sure that I don't have to divide my A, B, and C coefficients by a number. So I'm going to go ahead and identify my A, B, and C coefficients, and now I'm ready to start my X puzzle. So I'm going to multiply by my A and C, so it's going to be 6 and negative 7. So two numbers that multiply to a 6, but when I add them, I'm going to get a negative 7. So I'm thinking 6 and 1, because I've got 6 and 1, 6 times 1, 3 times 2, and 3 times 2, when I add 3 and 2, I'm never going to get to 7. And so I think these both have to be negative if I'm going to get a negative sum. And I'm going to check my math. Negative 6 times negative 1, negative 1. And then negative 6 plus negative 1 is a negative 7. So my numbers are correct. And now I'm going to fill in my X puzzle so I can factor this super fast. 3x squared, and then I'm going to get 2 down here in the bottom right. And now I know how I'm going to split up that negative 7x. It's going to be split up into negative 6x and negative 1x. Now, you don't have to put the 1 there. Oh, I should use blue. You don't have to put the negative, the 1 in front of that x, but you do have to show the negative sign. So now I'm going to factor this. So I've got to think, I'm going to look at my top row, and I want to GCF 3 and negative 1. Well, the only common number I can divide out of both is 1, so this has to be x, which means this has to be 3x. And if this is 3x, this has to be negative 2, And to get a negative 1x, a negative 1 times x will get me there. And then if I check, negative 1 times negative 2 does give me a positive 2. All right, so my factors are x minus 2 and 3x minus 1. Those are my factors. And now I'm going to look at the third trinomial that I'm going to factor. Negative 4x squared minus 8x plus 5. So again, I'm going to go to my calculator and I'm going to GCF math over 9. Remember, I cannot factor out GCF negative numbers, so I'm going to do 4 and 8. And that is a common 4, so now I'm going to do math over 9. I'm going to take my answer for my first two coefficients, my GCF for them, and comma 5. And 4 and 5 only have a 1. But if you notice, your A coefficient is negative. So what I am going to do is I am going to factor out a negative 1. I'm going to divide all of them by negative 1s because what that's going to do is that's going to change their sign. So now I have 4x squared plus 8x minus 5. And because I want my A coefficient to be positive. It just makes it easier to factor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm still going to have a negative 20, but on the bottom I'm going to have 8x. So I'm trying to think. Two numbers that multiply to 20, but when I add them I get 8. 4 and 5 won't work because that'll give me 9. 10 and 2, that'll get me to 8. Alright, and since my product's negative, one of my numbers has to be negative, and the 8 is positive, so that tells me that my 2 is the number that has to be negative, and my 10 is positive. So now I'm going to start filling in my boxes. So I'm going to fill it in with the new coefficients that I have. I'm not going to use the original, because remember, I've divided all of those coefficients by a negative 1, and they've changed. So I'm going to use 4x squared, and I always want my positive A coefficient in the box. Now I know how I'm going to split up that 8x. It's going to be split up into 10x and a negative 2x, and then I'm going to have in my bottom right box my negative 5, my constant. Alright, so here's what we're going to do. We are now going to start filling out the outside of our boxes. So 2x and 2x will make 4x. 2x times a positive 5 will give me 10x. And then negative 1 times 2x is going to give me negative 2x. And then negative 1 times 5 does give me negative 5. So my factors are 2x plus 5 and 2x minus 1. I barely fit all that in. Alright, so now we're going to look at special cases of factors. So we're going to look at perfect square trinomials and difference of squares. So a perfect square trinomial, that's where you can write it, guys, as a parenthesis squared. You're either going to have x plus something parenthesis squared or x minus something parenthesis squared. A difference of two squares is everything is going to match inside the parentheses except one parenthesis is going to be positive because you're adding and one's going to be negative for subtraction. And that's really the only thing. If you get enough practice, you can recognize these off the bat. So perfect square trinomials, we're just going to go ahead and factor in, and I'm going to check my GCF. I'm going to go ahead and GCF the last two because the first number is a 1. So I'm going to do 26 and 169. They do have 13, so now I'm going to GCF A 1, math over 9, 1 comma 13, and I think it's going to be a 1. So my GCF is a 1. And again, you always want to check your GCF first because if you can divide out a number, it's going to change your coefficients you're working with. So again, my A is 1 and my B coefficient is 26 and my C coefficient is 169. So you kind of want to think about this. You may not even have to do the X puzzle because what you're working with is you are working with X squared. And then if you're going to split this 26x evenly, that would be like having 13x and 13x in these diagonal boxes, which 13 times 13 is going to give you that 169 for the fourth box. So now I'm going to think, okay, this is going to be x and x, and then this is going to be 13x. So it's going to be plus 13, and this is also going to be plus 13. So if you notice on the outside of your boxes, you have the same terms, x plus 13, x plus 13. So it's like this, x plus 13 times x plus 13. And they're the same, which means you can write it as x plus 13 squared. Perfect square trinomial. Didn't even need your x box. And that you're going to recognize that because, again, your b coefficient is going to be even. So you can split it evenly. So I'm going to check this next one here and say math, right arrow 9. I've got 9, comma 24. They have a 3 in common, so now I'm going to say math, right arrow 9, 3, comma 16, and I don't think they have anything in common. So my GCF is 1, but I want to check. And so now I'm going to fill in my box. Again, you don't even need your x puzzle. So we're going to think x squared. This is kind of like when we completed the square. How would I split up a negative 24 evenly to draw those rectangles, those long skinny rectangles on the side? And this is going to be split up by negative 12x and a negative 12x. And negative 12 times negative 12 is going to be, oh, this is supposed to be 9x squared. Whew, okay, 9x squared. And then this is going to be plus 16x here in this bottom right corner. Threw me off, I forgot that 9x squared, that's why I paused for just a second. Okay, so now I'm going to use this. So remember, these have to match. So I've got to think of something that I can multiply that's the same, that's going to give me 9x squared. So that's going to be 3x and 3x. 3x times 3x is going to be 9x squared. Okay, if this is 3x, 3x times a negative 4 is going to give me 12x. And that's what has to go over here. And negative 4 times itself is going to give me 16. So I have 3x minus 4 times 3x minus 4. And that is going to turn into 3x minus 4 squared, since I have two of the same factors. All right, difference of squares. Here's how you're going to recognize this. You are going to recognize this because your b coefficient is 0, and a and c are perfect squares, numbers, okay? 9 and 36, those are going to be perfect squares, which means when I take the square root of 9 and the square root of 36, I'm going to get whole numbers, okay? So we're going to go ahead and fill this in. I'm going to say 9x squared and negative 36. Well, I already know that this is going to be 3x and 3x because these are going to match, except one's going to be addition, one's going to be subtraction. And then if I want to think about this, what is two numbers that are the same, one positive, one negative, that multiplies to make 36? And the answer is a positive 6 and a negative 6. And so now this is going to give me 3x minus plus 6 times 3x minus 6. So you can see both 3x's, both 6's, one's addition, one's subtraction. All right, so we're going to look here. X squared plus 18 is not a difference of squares. Yes, the b coefficient is 0, but if I look at my a coefficient, 18 is not a perfect square number. If I take the square root of 18, I'm not going to get a whole number. So factor using another method.